Hey guys, Dr. C here. I'm coming to you, pretend, from the library in the Convento Santo Domingo in Lima, Peru. Let's begin our discussion for today. All right, guys, I'm up here in the upper right-hand corner, creeping as always, and we've got Franz Boas here goofing off as well. What I am going to do in our lecture today is actually look at two different sets of theories. So first, we're going to talk about early anthro theories, and then we'll talk about some of the more modern anthro theories that are used today. So first off, why do we have anthropology in the first place? And the answer is to explain cultural diversity. The early anthropologists weren't exactly scholars going out there to research a group of people, write a book up, get some tenure, and be a cool professor. Most of the early perspectives on anthropology came from anthropologists who were sent by colonial governments to study the locals so that they could understand how to control them better. We're not proud of this at all. But this is part of anthropology's past, and it's something that we've had to acknowledge. So a lot of the early perspectives on anthropology did come from colonizers, but we also have a lot of early perspectives from missionaries, explorers, naturalists, etc. These were not really organized in any kind of academic way. And in many cases, they were what we call from the veranda. In other words, white people like on the veranda of some colonizer building looking down, or maybe like from a tourist hotel, like looking down at all of the local people and going, oh, look at the neat practices they do. So obviously this was not a way to engage in any kind of testable, repeatable, studyable kind of science. This wasn't any kind of academic field. And so from these hot mess of perspectives would come a series of theories in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? Late 19th century, early 20th century. You would see a whole variety of perspectives and theories be launched in a number of countries that would help us to understand how we categorize and catalog this cultural diversity in an actually academically rigorous way. So first, I want to talk about evolutionism, because that was the first set of theories that we tried. And basically the argument was that human differences can be accounted for by the fact that some cultures are more primitive and some cultures are more advanced. Like I said, early anthropology did derive out of the colonial experience. So essentially this was a bunch of old white dudes being like, you know, our culture is like so much more advanced than those brown people's are. Holy crap, guys. I'm not even going to go into the specific research of each of the main theorists here, because right off the bat, it should be pretty clear that this is a shitbox theory that we are not going to entertain anymore. We have discredited this within anthropology. You still hear these arguments all the time in popular culture and media. Oh, some cultures are just more advanced than others. I am an anthropologist. That's what my fucking PhD is in. And I can tell you that that is such bogus BS, racist, bigoted. Evolutionism is wrong. It is academically discredited. All right, so let's move to some good theories, right? The main theory or approach to anthropology that emerged from Great Britain is functionalism. And functionalism essentially says that cultures are made up of lots of different parts that serve functions in our lives. In order for society to run smoothly, in order for people to live together and prosper and defeat nature and have all their basic needs met and also be pretty happy in the world, we need all sorts of things. We need government, we need rituals, we need religion, we need economics. We need these cultural parts in order to function properly. And each of these parts serves a function. So let me break it down for a couple of theorists that I find particularly interesting out of the functionalist camp: Bronislaw Malinowski and E. Evans Pritchard. Bronislaw Malinowski was a British anthropologist. Now, he was Polish by birth with a name like Bronislaw Malinowski, but he taught in Britain and studied in Britain before that. His fieldwork was in the Trobriand Islands, which are way out in the middle of the Pacific, and he looked at exchange and social systems and the way that goods and ideas were swapped and grown. He looked at ideas of reciprocity. He's also sort of thought about as the best ethnographer or the father of ethnography because he just went out to the Trobriand Islands and lived there for a whole long time so that he could really participate in culture. So he is seen as the first true ethnographer because he didn't go out there as a colonizer. He just went out there to study stuff because he was interested in studying stuff. Evans Pritchard was a British anthropologist who worked in East Africa. He is one of the sort of fathers of British anthropology and was particularly interesting because he looked at witchcraft and magic, things like oracles and deceit, particularly amongst the Azande people as well as the Noors. Okay, so let's depart the British perspective on anthropology and look at the French perspective, towards anthropology. The French school of thought really emphasized structuralism, which argues that there are overarching structures in existence and overarching structures within society, and these are the very foundations upon which culture is built. So structuralists will say, why do certain things happen in our society? Well, let's look at the overall structures, the government, the economic systems. Let's also look at structures from the environment and our ecology, and of course, the structures of our body, to be able to understand why things are happening in the world. So this is the very French approach. I do want to talk about one old dude theorist. Claude Lévi-Strauss was a French anthropologist and really somebody that looked at myth and storytelling. So he is considered one of the fathers of modern anthropology. And in many ways, his ideas about structuralism really set the foundations for anthropology. And he was particularly interested in the way that humanity sets up binaries as part of our existence: day, night, male, female, good, bad, truth, lie, etc. So he really argues that our minds and our mythologies are tied to these overarching structures, especially binaries. Okay, so let's leave the Frenchies behind and specifically look at the American school of thought towards anthropology. And the American school of thought towards anthropology actually emerges at the turn of the 20th century, so like 120 years ago, plus or minus, at Columbia University in New York City. And that's because the department was headed by a guy named Franz Boas. I'm going to talk about him in a little bit. He was the guy that started off this presentation. And he really pushed for empiricism. And this is because Boas actually had a background in the hard sciences. So he was like, yo, we really need to stop being so subjective about this. And we really need to take like a direct hard science STEM approach. So empiricism. It says that theories must be based on the shit that we see, direct observation, personal interaction. You got to interview people. You got to objectively describe things. You have to actually view it like a scientist. You got to keep detailed notes. You got to catalog things, right? And then you can use scientific rationality to draw conclusions based on the evidence that you have collected in an empirical manner. This is basically like the dominant approach towards field work today. Like structuralism and functionalism, these are the dominant approaches to sort of the philosophy behind anthropology and other social sciences. But empiricism is the approach to field work. It's the approach to the way that we get our data. And then structuralism and functionalism help us to understand how we think about that data once we have it. So the American school is super important. And that's why I'm going to talk about three theorists really briefly: Franz Boas, Margaret Mead, and Ruth Benedict. Franz Boas was an American cultural anthropologist who is known as the father of American anthropology, primarily because he started the anthropology department at Columbia University. And there he actually taught Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit. He's particularly important because he came up with the idea of cultural relativism, which I've already talked about earlier this semester, as well as historical particularism, which just says, look, you have to understand a culture within its history and within its particular point in time. Ruth Benedict was also an American anthropologist in the 1930s, and she was also the president of the American Anthropological Association for a long time, which was a pretty huge deal for a woman. Her research really looked at patterns and the way that culture fits into nice, neat patterns that repeat themselves. She did her fieldwork in pre-World War II Japan, so a lot of it is incredibly interesting to read if you're into Japanese culture. Another important American cultural anthropologist is Margaret Mead. She was a little bit later than Boas and Ruth Benedict. She did her field work in Samoa and looked at women, childbirth, growing up, puberty, coming of age rituals, etc. Her work is incredibly controversial even today, but she is one of the most well known and well respected anthropologists outside of the field of anthropology. She also had a sexy, sexy romantic relationship with Ruth Benedict. So that's kind of one of those interesting anthro stories that we don't talk about so much, but we really should talk about more, yes. Okay, so now that we've worked our way through the three big historical perspectives, all of which are still totally relevant today. And if you take advanced anthropology classes in the department, you will run into professors who are structuralists and you'll run into professors who are functionalists. Every anthropologist kind of puts themselves in one of those camps or in one of the other camps, which I'm going to get to in a few seconds. These early theories were incredibly important, but they were also a little problematic because they often assumed that societies always behaved the same way and everybody within that society behaved the same way. So as long as I understood the structures of a society, the same truths must be true for all members of that society because they all have to interact with the same structures. This is a little problematic, right? Like, you're living in society right now. Do you think your experience is the same as somebody who's living out in Idaho right now, right? So it's a little problematic, right? To say that cultures don't change and that everybody within a culture has the same cultural experience. As a result, we've had to come up with some more modern, refined theories which help us to approach and understand the differences that people experience even within the same culture or society. First of all, we have the materialists. This emerged kind of in conjunction with Marxism, so it looks a lot at the material conditions of life, but it argues that the reason there's so much cultural diversity is because we have to adapt to our physical environment, to the foods that are available to us because of that physical environment, to the technologies that are available to us, etc. And so it says that if we want to understand a culture and we want to really understand a people, we have to understand the material conditions that they experience and then the way that they translate those material conditions into things like economics. Next, you have the interpretive symbologists. These are the guys who say, look, the reason that we have so many different cultures and the reason we have cultural difference is because culture is actually just made up of a whole bunch of different symbols. And over time, we create new symbols and we interpret symbols. And so cultures diversify and cultures change. And the reason we have diversity within a culture is because not everybody agrees on the symbols. And so not everybody sees the same symbols, meaning the same things at the same time. And so culture is that complex web that holds us all in place. So it really focuses on symbols and meanings. And you would probably say that Clifford Geertz, that's this very handsome bro right here, like Grandpapa here. Clifford Geertz is kind of considered one of the fathers of modern anthropology. And from the 1960s through the 1990s was pretty much the most important living anthropologist of his time. He did his field work in Morocco and North Africa. That's part of the reason I'm a Moroccanist. And he really focused on doing ethnography where you would look at the symbols within the culture that you were studying and try to understand all of the different layers between those symbols and unpack them. And the other perspective I want to talk about are conflict perspectives. This kind of emerges from a sort of game theory perspective, or the idea that we exist in conflict and in contrast with other groups. And so the only way that a culture or society defines itself is in contrast to other groups, other cultures, other societies. Laila Abu-Lughod and Saba Mahmoud are two excellent anthropologists that look at women in the Muslim world, and they write some of the best conflict perspectives in modern anthropology today. And finally, there is a weird little sub-branch of anthropology that I can't help but acknowledge, which are those who follow the reflexive perspective. And those are anthropologists who like to study and write about anthropology. In other words, they like to analyze how the anthropologist actually experiences ethnography when they're going through ethnography. And they like to think about how the anthropologist's biases actually affect what they see when they go and do field work. So reflexive anthropologists focus a lot on issues of ethics, impact. So reflexive perspective is actually anthropology looking at anthropology, which is really, really meta and very interesting. All right, guys, thank you very much for following along, and be sure to join into discussion this week so that we can talk about how these various perspectives will apply for this semester, as well as for your anthropological understanding going forward.